I'd ask if our next panel could now begin to come to the stage, Brian Lee Crowley and the panelists, as I introduce the panel. And essentially on this panel, we want to talk about the challenges of, okay, last minute adjustments. It's okay, you're all right. The challenges of youth unemployment and underemployment, which have been with us for so many years. Not surprisingly, though, the hurdles facing younger people were magnified in recent years by the global financial crisis and the recession that followed it. Some commentators have warned of a potential, and I use quotation marks here, lost generation of Canadians condemned to years of part-time and precarious work. So the question that we want to put to our first panel is exactly how serious are those challenges, and what does the future hold for young Canadians? In your programs, you have the bios for all of our speakers, so briefly, let me say we have David Coletto, Chief Executive Officer of Abacus Data, which produced a report for us just last week, which you also have in your kits. Lauren Friese, Chief Executive Officer of TalentEgg, and Trish Hennessy, a Director with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I've got one person more than I thought I had if Mr. Bartlett did not come.
No, he
is here. Okay,
I'm the one you didn't mention, John.
I haven't got to you yet.
Oh, well,
and Randall Bartlett, Senior Economist of TD, is in fact here, although I was just told moments ago that he was not. So glad to have you here, Randall, and thank you especially to Brian Lee Crowley from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for accepting our invitation to moderate this panel. Brian, now it's over to you.
Thanks very much, John. You and I were both at the ballet last night, Alice in Wonderland, and it sort of sets us up for this discussion a little bit. And speaking of Alice in Wonderland, we're going to start by having a little insight from the source of all that's good and true in Canada, the CBC. We're going to run a little video clip from the CBC talking about youth unemployment. Can we run that clip, please?
In Canada, the recession has eased for many, but not for young people. Youth unemployment is double the general population, just under 15%. Compared to 4 years ago, there are 250,000 fewer young people with jobs. Those lucky enough to find employment are often overqualified for the jobs they're forced to accept.
Serving has no future. It's a dead end.
Jobless and underemployed young people today can mean a bankrupt Canada tomorrow.
Canada will be in the decline because future wealth is built on people's skills, on the skills of the population.
While the crisis deepens, the generation in power only makes things worse.
Well, I'm going to start by asking Randall. Randall, what's your reaction to the way the CBC in that generation jobless clip we just saw has characterized the problem of youth unemployment? They call it a crisis. Are they right?
Well, I don't know that I'd be on the same page with the views that the CBC put forth in that broadcast. We put out a report back in December at TD looking at youth joblessness and how it compares to sort of a broader context, the context of history, the context of the business cycle, youth employment and unemployment relative to total employment in the economy. So, of course, while there may be 250,000 more youth unemployed, the size of the economy has actually increased quite dramatically, and the size of employment in Canada has increased quite dramatically. And what we found could probably be best characterized by the Who song, The Kids Are All Right. What we found was that youth unemployment today is actually roughly where we'd expect it to be at this point in the business cycle. Compared to history, during previous recessions back in the 90s and 1980s, youth unemployment was actually significantly higher. In fact, in the early 1980s, it was around 25%. So the recent crisis actually didn't hit the highs that we've seen historically. Additionally, if you look at the outcomes of youth education today and the employment the youth are getting, if you look at things like the National Graduate Survey, National Household Survey, we actually see that the outcomes of youth employment today are among the better that we've seen at this point in the business cycle in history. So I definitely wouldn't characterize it the same way as the CBC.
Okay, now I want to say to all the members of the panel, if you want to leap in on any of these questions, please feel free to do so, but I also want to keep moving, so unless you signal to me that you want to speak, I'm going to move along. Lauren, just following up on Randall's comment, he seems to be saying that youth unemployment isn't quite the problem that's presented on the CBC, but on the other hand, are we wrong to paint all youth with the same brush? Is it a uniform problem or uniform lack of a problem?
I would say that often when we're having discussions about youth unemployment, the examples that are used are young people who have participated in post-secondary education. And I think that the outcomes for young people who have just completed high school or who still are in school versus those who have graduated are very, very different. And it's important to remember that. I think just following on what you said, it's not necessarily that youth unemployment today is much worse relatively to how it has been historically. It's that it's always been very difficult to make a transition from the world of school and into the world of work. And now we have this handy statistic and we have this sort of ubiquitous message in the media that's making us all talk about it now. And I think that's actually a really important and a really positive thing because it doesn't have to be so difficult and there doesn't have to be so much friction, and that friction is very damaging.
And so what do you want to tell us about that friction?
Well, I think that you have this system where there are three main parts. There's students, there's universities and colleges, and there are employers. And I think that from a student perspective, when you're 16 or 17 and you're thinking about university and college, you're generally not mature enough. You don't have enough knowledge of what's coming next to make a very informed decision on what to choose to study and what school to go to, and those major decisions. I think that employers in today's economy very much rely on those decisions, the decisions that young people are making at the age of 16 or 17 by increasingly narrowing their focus to recruiting from programs like engineering at Waterloo or commerce at Queen's. And I think that universities and colleges are promoting themselves, their marketing departments are promoting themselves as job preparation. And I think that if they are job preparation, nobody's told the professors that.
Okay. As a recovering academic, I can attest to that. Trish, I think you were quite keen to get in front of this particular audience. I think you have some things that you would like to say to them because you think of them as quite powerful people in the economy. But let's start by saying that I think I'm right in saying that your view is that there's not a skills gap between the skills that students have and those needed by employers, but rather you think there's a training gap. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, first of all, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here. I was told that I'm the first person from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives to be invited to speak to this room, and so it's an honor. I just want to say that part of the discussion that's been unfolding in Canada around youth, around millennials, is that they've become an entitled generation. That the problem of making sure that they're firmly attached to the labor market has been individualized, and so has this been the solution. But I think that we can all recognize that this generation actually brings a lot of amazing things to the table. First of all, they are the most formally educated generation in our times to have ever come out of Canada. We told them to go get an education, and they did so in spades. It's remarkable. We're leading the OECD in terms of post-secondary attainment. So that should be recognized. They're doing it. The millennials that I work with and encounter, I find are very innovative and creative, and I find that they're more collaborative, and maybe it is because some of them are entering or are exiting post-secondary education, not finding the kind of job opportunities that they were promised. And so they're finding ways to work and engage with each other. So I actually find a lot of hope in this generation. And the thing is that you have all of this stuff. You have these amazing young people at your disposal. And there has always been, in the history of time, a certain amount of skills mismatch out there. But we do have an opportunity to build a stronger bridge between the formal learning part of anyone's career or work life and what happens after that. Not just the entry-level job training that often gets focused on how to land a job, how to maybe build up some of those soft skills so you can do entry-level work, but throughout the entire life cycle of a person's work. We know that companies that invest in ongoing training opportunities, informal and formal, mentoring, the whole package, you invest in them and those workers invest in you all the more.
Thanks very much. David, one of the things that Mona Murshid said that quite struck me, and I don't want to overstate it, but she said something like, gosh, you know, the post-secondary education world's a bit of a data-free zone. We don't seem to possess all the knowledge that we could and should have in order to evaluate what's going on in the post-secondary world, to be able to guide students to make intelligent choices and so on. You're not a data-free guy. You are a data guy. So tell us a little bit about what you've discovered about
well, I think one of the perspectives that we have to keep in mind, I speak to a lot of organizations about millennials, trying to recruit them, and I say, we often talk about skills gaps, there's the lack of skills training. I also think there's a gap in just frame of mind. How many of you in this room have kids between the ages of 18 and 35? Okay, so the vast majority of you. And I always say, think about your own kids and your own parenting of them. So when we think of the perspective that a young person has, it's first of all, mainly all your fault that young people are the way they are. And that is, the decision making about what to take in post-secondary is driven partly by that young person's decision, but there's an incredible influence that parents have on young people's decisions, at least initially, in what they're going to take in university. And so the question I think about is, first, this is a generation that, yes, is struggling a little bit, but our data from the survey that we did shows that by no means are millennials overwhelmingly pessimistic about the future or think that the world's ending under their feet. But what they do feel is that they were promised a lot. You all told us that we could be anything we wanted, that we should follow our dreams, study what we want, do what we love, right? Do what you love to do, because all of you worked really hard and maybe gave up some of those passions. Well, you have an entire generation of people who think this way, entering post-secondary, who, and I teach at Carleton, so I'll be the first to say, we aren't, I don't think, training them to be employees. We're training them to think and to study certain topics, particularly in the liberal arts, if you're in the social sciences or arts like I was. But the expectations that we have, and our survey showed this, aren't met when they come out into the world. And so they can't do what it is they want to do, what you all told us we should be able to do. And so one of the fundamental differences I think we have to understand is this is a generation that has a completely different frame of mind than your generation, than my grandfather's generation. And so it's not so much that we don't necessarily have the skills, it's that, and millennials admitted in our survey, they don't necessarily, they look around themselves and they see their peers who want the best things out of life, but don't really want to work so hard. And so one of the findings from the McKinsey study that shows there's a gap in how people perceive work ethic, and we see the same thing among our survey work.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the gap in terms of work ethic? I'm betting that this is something that will resonate with some of the people in the room.
Well, I mean, no millennial will admit that they're lazy, right, or that they're entitled. But they do say, well, a lot of my friends and colleagues are in the generation. And So no one wants to admit it themselves, but they see it. And I think one of the things, it's not so much entitlement that I somehow deserve a job because I've got my university or college degree, but it is this sense, I think, this profound sense that, you know, we were told, and I was told this, I'm 33, I was told this when I was in post-secondary, when you graduate, all those 60-year-olds are going to retire, and there's going to be lots of jobs. There's going to be more jobs than you can fill, and there's going to be incredible competition for it. And I went and I got my university. Now, I turned out okay, luckily, but I see my students' eyes, who are in communications and public affairs programs at Carleton, and they're fourth-year students, and they fundamentally don't know what they're going to be doing at the end. So there is part work ethic gap. I see it in a little bit of them, but I also don't think they've been prepared properly. So I see the McKinsey report as being relevant from the students that I work with.
Trish.
I think through the annals of time, we actually have been guilty of always talking about that new young generation. They don't work as hard. You know, they're not willing to do what my generation did. They're not willing to sacrifice as much. I know that young baby boomers were told that during the Woodstock era. You can just go back through the history of time. And, you know, we're very much guilty as we age of applying our set of values and standards to another generation. And I think that when we do that, we're just individualizing problems and sort of putting our hands up and saying, but it's not my fault, you know, I did my best. I think this is a great problem to have in Canada, that you have a generation of highly educated young people who were taught to demand more, and they are demanding more of us. And I would say to young people, demand more of us, because we could be delivering far more to help you attach to the labor market and succeed to your full potential.
Great. Okay, now I've given everybody a chance to kind of get their oar in, and now I'm going to pose a few questions, and it's first come, first serve, okay? We've heard a lot about the $1 million return to a university degree. In other words, that somebody who gets a university degree is going to earn $1 million more lifetime earnings compared to someone who doesn't get such a degree. Given the perceived mismatch between the skills demanded by employers and those possessed by today's youth, does that number still apply? And does it apply across the board? Is it a uniform $1 million? Or does it matter what you're studying? Randall?
Well, I think I think the number still holds true. I think if you look at the data from StatCan and the OECD and that kind of thing, the returns to an education are very, very strong still. And part of that is higher earnings, hourly earnings, that kind of thing, but also the greater likelihood of being employed consistently over your lifetime. So those returns are definitely there. I think the issue more relates to individuals having expectations for what's required in the job market, and the ability to apply those skills quickly and readily to meet the needs of employers, that kind of thing. Additionally, I think that the youth today are looking for more potentially from an employment situation than people in the past. They're bringing very creative skills and potentially a broader skill set to the job market than was previously required. So I think in that sense, it's a new sort of more entrepreneurial class than potentially we've seen in the past. And so I really just think the skills and expectations are potentially different than maybe required at the outset, but I think the return is still there to a post-secondary education, and the data bears that out.
Well, the data also bears out that, especially during economic downturns, if you have a post-secondary degree, you are more likely to have a job or to keep a job if you're young. So this revolution happened a generation ago. The university degree really is the ticket into a job, more so than if you don't have one. But it's what kind of job, and also, is it a secure job, or are we educating more and more young people and putting them out there into a precarious work market? And to do blanket statements on national numbers in Canada is maybe to overlook some of the nuances of what's going on here. I look at Ontario as a bit of a canary in a coal mine in terms of how we transition to a post-industrial era and how ready we are for that. And we do know that in Ontario, young workers are experiencing, and even young workers with degrees, are more and more of them are holding down temporary jobs. And a quarter of them in Ontario say that, they identify as involuntarily part-time employed. They actually would prefer a full-time job, so there's the underemployment side of the equation as well.
I guess I wonder how much of that number is driven by, is causation versus correlation. You know, is it just that because a university or college degree or diploma is kind of table stakes now, is that having some sort of is that leading to that number? And I wonder if, as employers start to be more open to accepting boot camps and other forms of educations and training as table stakes, if we'd see a difference in that number and in that gap.
Well, Lauren, since you've stepped up here, let me ask you to expand a little bit on something you said at the beginning, and you talked about how university marketing departments sell degrees as sort of a license for a job, but you didn't think that anybody from the marketing department had ever talked to the professoriate. And I thought about that when I was watching some of Mona Moorshed's slides, because I was particularly struck by that one that said that was over 80% of people who actually provide post-secondary education think that they're preparing people perfectly for work. But it's clear that employers and students don't share that view. That doesn't make the professoriate wrong, but interested in.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask a student why they've chosen to go to university or to college, they'll tell you it's to get a job. If you ask the university marketing department that exact same question, you know, why do you bring students into your institutions? They would also say it's to help young people get jobs. And if you speak to professors, they would give you a completely different answer based around what you said before, you know, education and critical thinking skills and that kind of thing. I think it's okay that universities and colleges are not about job training as long as they're clear about that message when they're communicating with students, so that students, when they're in those environments, when they're in those institutions, can take it upon themselves to get the job training, the preparation, the experiences that they need in order to be marketable when they graduate.
Well, there's a new book out, well, it's a couple of years old now, I guess, in the States, in which they decided to test this proposition, which we hear very often from university professors. I'm a former professor, so I've even been guilty of saying this myself, in which they said, it's not our job to teach people job skills. Our job is to teach people critical thinking. And so the authors of this book actually decided to take that seriously, and they did 2 decades worth of study of the cognitive abilities of students entering and leaving university. And they discovered that the cognitive capacity of students leaving university was lower than when they went in. You're giggling, but it's not so funny, I think.
Well, fair enough. One point I'd like to make to expand on that point actually is that the youth of today, when you look at the numeracy and literacy abilities of youth today as compared to previous generations, it's actually higher. They score higher compared to their peers on international scales in Canada than other OECD countries. So we are producing youth that are generally more numerate and more literate than their peers and in previous generations. But there certainly is that mismatch between whether or not those skills are relevant to the employer or not. And that's really what's critical to making that transition into lifelong employment and higher earnings.
I do think that we run the risk here, though, of creating a false dichotomy, of saying it's only one type of education or another, one pathway into the labor market or another, when we know it's a mix. And we've had this conversation for a long time. I was in my 20s in the 1980s, leaving journalism school, and I'd gone to a community college program that had a practicum because I understood the value of mixing formal learning with real life experience. But even then, I went for my first summer job as a newspaper, and I was driving around Saskatchewan to all these small town newspapers asking for a summer job. And I'll never forget the managing editor of the Swift Current newspaper sat back and he said, you went to school? No, I'd rather just have you blank slate and train you myself because they're teaching you all wrong. And I didn't get that summer job, I got another one. But that has been, there's these dichotomies when in fact it can be a mix of everything. And every one of us in this room got to be who we are and how we are, not just by the formal learning we may or may not have engaged in and paid for, but also all that informal stuff that happens day to day in the workplace. How do I work this new software program? How do I deal with this new computer system? It happens all the time. So I think that, I just think we run the danger of saying universities are outdated and don't get it, when it's a whole mix of things that have to happen, especially in a global knowledge economy where we need people to have a range of portable skills and critical thinking. So it's more complicated, I would submit.
We have a second video clip, which I think we're calling the Justin clip, not in honor of a political party leader, but because it's the name of the person in the video. Can we roll that clip, please?
I'm Dustin, and I'm a pro bono marketing and social media consultant for nonprofits in the GTA. Instead of using a waterfall background, I've opted to use my room to reflect properly on employment. Now, Martin Ford, a futurist from Silicon Valley, has estimated that 75% of all human beings will be unemployed by the end of the century, all due to increased automation. Many fear that only extremely specialized white-collar jobs will be not replaced by machines. What can governments, universities, and employers do today to ensure that young Canadians are employable in an age of increased automation?
Well, Justin asked a few questions there. Does anybody want to leap in? I know that there are various people on the panel have expressed concerns to me about the effects of automation on the availability of jobs. He's asking about whether or not universities are doing what they need to do in order to help him get a job. What's the answer to Justin's
I'll take
observations?
There's been technological innovation in our economy, the global economy, for millennia, and among the largest being the Industrial Revolution, and then at the early part of the 20th century with hydraulics and electricity, internal combustion engine, that kind of thing. So what happened at that point was we actually produced individuals. There was the high school movement in North America in particular, and then in Europe, which produced individuals with advanced skill levels that were able to capitalize and take advantage of these new technologies. And we saw it again in the 1980s. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the US, there's some Harvard labor professors that look at this kind of thing. And what they found was that in the US, the return to higher education was more the result of you had this technological innovation and there wasn't the supply to keep up with the demand for these skilled people in the US where there had been in the early part of the 20th century. In Canada, in contrast, we actually performed better because we had more female participation in the labor force where it was more held back in the US. And women have very much capitalized on that and now are very much the majority of university graduates and majority of graduate level graduates, that kind of thing. So I think that what needs to happen is that the educational system needs to adapt. It needs to meet the demands of the changing global environment, and that and students need to be able to make those changes as well and to be flexible. And I think that already that's being borne out in the numbers, that individuals from degree programs that have lower employment rates are more likely to go back for other types of studies than degree programs that have higher employment rates. Also, people with higher levels of education tend to be much more mobile and willing to move to other jurisdictions. So I think that to be able to increase the flexibility and dynamism of our labor force is really key to being able to capitalize on new technologies and innovations.
Anyone else? No?
Well, if you are asking the next generation of Canadians to not only be more equipped educationally, but to be ready to be mobile, to go wherever the jobs are, then I think we have to get real about the kind of public program supports we need to make that happen. We're already asking students to go deeper into personal debt, to fund their own education so that they can have doors potentially open for them. But to do that in Ottawa where we are and then have to move to Calgary and not know that you're going to actually have a full-time stable job requires something else, I think. So I think that we need to get real about what, and especially if if we do become a more automated society and we do phase out some types of jobs as well, what happens if that dream of full employment actually fades away? What happens if you have a growing number of workers who really are part of a permanent precariat? And what public programs and services do we need to support that future reality if that's the case? I think those are really big policy questions that are worth talking about now before it happens.
Saw you nodding, David. Did you want to?
Well, no, I think it's a good point. I was just hearkening back to the previous question and thinking about, what is missing in, talk to business leaders, they say they don't have the skills, the soft skills that we need. There's something missing in terms of their perspective. Living here in Ottawa, you can't sort of leave the political bubble and following public affairs. But what's shocking to me, and I teach in social sciences, and I do lots of survey work with 18 to 35-year-olds, is their lack of even basic understanding of what's going on in the world itself, right? And I think we often talk about this generation being incredibly connected, and that's true. No generation in history could have connections across the world like this one can. But at the same time, they're so isolated from the world itself. So that if you ask, for example, my class, a fourth-year communications class, what is Idle No More? And only 3 out of 40 students raised their hands saying they'd ever heard of that. We live in Ottawa. This is a Carleton University class. Sorry if anyone's from Carleton here. But it's shocking to me, right, that this was supposed to be the liberal arts program of social science, and they don't even know what Idle No More was, which was a fairly big deal here in Ottawa and around the country. So the question I have is, it's not just maybe that we're not training or the students don't think they have the skills or employers don't think they have the skills, but I think it's broader than that. Is our education system, like we moved away from breadth towards technical and focused skills, which if you think back 20 or 30 years ago and you were getting a science degree, you also took, some maybe political science or sociology and things like that. No longer do you really have to do that. And I think all of you in this room want employees who actually know what's going on in the world, in part because they're going to be able to contribute, maybe changing your strategy or focusing on what's coming next. And, if you're having a young generation in the workplace interacting with older members of your workforce and you have nothing to talk about because you don't even know what's going on in the world, that creates problems in terms of productivity and synergies and things like that. So I think there's the problem with my generation is much broader than simply we have really high expectations. It's that we become incredibly isolated because of technology, not despite it.
Well, since David's talked about his generation, let me just ask if anybody else noticed that in the video clip with Justin, he talked about the responsibility of universities, and he talked about the responsibility of employers, and he talked about the responsibility of the government. He didn't say anything about what his responsibilities were. I'm not saying that the others don't have responsibility. Of course they do. But what about his responsibilities or his generation's responsibilities? Are they living up to those?
Well, I'll just add one other point we found in our report, and I was talking to Lauren about it. The other thing to keep in mind about this generation that is different from previous ones is what I call this arrested development of the generation. So you talk about personal responsibility, but you also have to keep in mind that, again, for all the parents in the room, our survey suggests that over a quarter of Canadians 25 to 35 still live with their parents. Right? 30% still say they are not financially independent. So this is and these are 25 and older. So to think about 20 years ago and you said, what is an adult? What's the definition of an adult? Right? It's usually somebody who's moved out of their parents' home, has become financially independent, maybe has gotten married or has a long-term partner and perhaps has a kid and owns a house, right? All things that require some responsibility, things that might anchor you into a career or a job, that for most young people entering the workforce today, they are so far away from those realities that they aren't thinking personal responsibility yet. They're still thinking about laying down some roots and having any responsibility. And I think that's a fundamental difference between this generation and previous ones, large part because of the cost of post-secondary and the fact that more and more people are doing it and doing it for longer. But add to the fact that even women are doing far more post-secondary. So 30 years ago, maybe a 25-year-old female, didn't go to post-secondary, and so she could start a family. That's not happening anymore. So big changes in demographics and costs that I think are driving this delayed adulthood.
Lauren?
I was just going to say, the percentage of 21-year-olds, the typical age when somebody graduates from university or college that is mature enough to take ownership of their career has severely declined over the years. And I think that's something very important for employers to take into consideration. And also, we have this assumption that everybody graduates and is suddenly ready to enter the workplace. I think we need to change our definition of, entry level. What is entry level? Can somebody be entry level when they're 25 or 30, or are we going to continue, from an employer perspective, saying, we only recruit students who are still in school or have only graduated within 1 year? Again, I think with young people being younger than ever before and going through this arrested development, we need to start being more flexible about that.
I don't know. This arrested development it really personalizes what's going on. It's like, what's deficient in this particular generation? When I think about myself at age 18, first person in my rural Saskatchewan family to go to university. For grade 12, for graduation, I got a set of luggage, and that was a symbol of like, get out now and go do it. But university costs less, and because of my socioeconomic background, there were more grants and bursaries to help me along as well. So I didn't face that paralyzing student debt that a lot of kids who would have come from my circumstances would be facing now. And so you can see why they would stay home longer, especially if they live in a city and they can still do that. You can see that they're actually maybe making personally responsible choices to do that, because why would you rack up even more personal debt to go and rent out a very expensive apartment? So I kind of want, and I'm thinking, I was 18, I was a bit of a train wreck. I didn't even know how to write a check. Remember when we had to write checks to get money out? I think sometimes we forget that every generation, we get pushed out there and we're a little bit like a Bambi, a fawn who's just having trouble learning how to walk.
But I think the argument is just that is lasting longer, and that it's not deficient, it's different.
Right.
Well, so we've talked a little bit about post-secondary institutions. We've talked a little bit about students. Let's talk about employers, since we've got a room full of them. Again, just drawing a little inspiration from Mona Murshid's presentation, it seems to me that one of the things that came through very clearly was that some of the most successful programs at helping young people move into employment were actually driven mostly by employers, sometimes in partnership with post-secondary institutions, but it involved employers saying, okay, I'm not getting what I need when people show up on the doorstep fresh out of university or technical college. So I'm going to take some responsibility for this. I'm going to figure out what exactly it is I need, and I'm going to work with either I'm going to bring people in and give them that education here at the workplace, or I'm going to form a partnership with a post-secondary institution. What's your view? Obviously, Mona's presentation looked at a broad range of countries. What's happening here, and what more could be done? Randall?
Well, I don't think there's any better way to meet the demand that you have as a company than to work with students and work with universities and educators in order to ensure that the skill set you require is being met when students graduate. I mean, cooperative programs are a good way of doing that. As an example, we had a sort of large hiring process recently and had a great deal of difficulty finding people who can work in sort of an economics shop that have the quantitative background necessary, but also the ability to communicate that is also required in our job. So making sure that students have those skills, working with institutions and students through the process, but also post-secondary institutions understanding what the skills are that employers need and integrating that into the educational process. I think it would go a long way into smoothing the transfer from education to work.
Lauren?
I think that the benefits of work-integrated learning, like co-ops and internships as part of a curriculum or as part of a program, are well understood and well appreciated in Canada. I guess my problem with co-ops and internships, and I think that they're very good and they should still exist, but the problem is that they rely again on the choice of a young person at the age of 17 to choose the Waterloo co-op program or the Laurier co-op program or whatever it is. And so I like programs like, for example, the Career Launch program at RBC, which offers a paid one-year internship, which is mostly about training for anybody who has graduated recently who can't find meaningful employment. You know, then that's just one example, and I think we all hope to see more of that. I'm not sure if anybody knows the program, but yeah, work integrated learning and opportunities for young people that truly have no experience are well understood.
And paid opportunities.
Yeah.
I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the problem of unpaid internships and how that can actually reinforce income inequality on a number of levels. It can prevent people who come from lower income backgrounds from even having those kind of quality training experiences. And so that's you know, prevention of equality of opportunity, but then over the long term that can prevent equality of outcome as well. And you know, I think that we all agree in this room that Canada has a strong foundation of being able to offer a degree of both, a modicum of both, quality of opportunity and of outcome as well. And so that's an opportunity for those of you in this room to think about. The other thing is the Conference Board of Canada has this number that says that between 1993 and 2013, per employee spending on training in Canada decreased by 40%. So there's room to grow. I know that many, there are employers in this room who offer a lot of training, and I know that you have concerns about poaching as well. But I think that taking leadership like what you're doing with this conversation today, trying to change the culture of employers all across the spectrum is really important, that training is important, not only for your bottom line today, but if we're going to actually turn the corner as a country and make sure that Canada can compete on a global stage 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now.
David? No? Well, we talked about co-op programs and internships and so on, but again, based on my experience at universities, which are not the only post-secondary institutions out there, but they're a pretty important one, there's a lot of resistance, particularly on the part of the professoriate, to anything that smacks of employers reaching into the institution and influencing what happens there. Is that a problem?
This
Lauren.
is exactly where we need to clarify what university is, and that's all I have to say about that.
Randall?
Well, I think that it takes political will in order for institutions to change that are publicly funded, and I think that's really where that needs to go. Building on Trish's point, actually, I mean, not only are students incurring a great deal of debt, but co-op programs actually incur a cost to students often, in addition to delaying entry into the labor force by an additional year. So while they may get compensation while doing the co-op, they pay more per semester and then have an additional year of education. And if you look at the numbers, the employment rates and compensation are actually better if you did a 4-year degree and then a master's than to do a 5-year degree, including a co-op. So at the end of 3 years after graduation. So at the end of the day, I think co-op programs need to become more integrated. If you look at schools like Ryerson and that kind of thing, where students can come out, work in an industry for several years, have a good paying job when they come out, and be well integrated into that industry. I think that's important and will go a long way. But I think ultimately it's political will that's going to change an institution like the university setting.
Okay, I think we're going to move to some questions from the floor. I see that Linda Hassenfratz has her hand up here in the front. Perhaps we can get Linda a microphone.
Thanks. Linda Hassenfratz. I'm CEO of Linamar. We're a diversified manufacturing company. It appears to me that a big issue is a lack of information. You know, we've been talking about these topics for years and years. We've been talking about these challenges. And there's all kinds of great programs that have been put in place, information that's been made available that people just don't know about, nor do we talk enough about them. I mean, I look right from the secondary school level. In Ontario, we have the specialist high skills major program. Something like 17 or 18% of graduates from a high school in Ontario are graduating with a specialist high skills major designation. In 20 different areas from medicine to arts and media to manufacturing, construction, etc. It's got quite a wide range. It includes experiential learning, which I think is critical, and I'm actually really surprised by your statistic that people who went through co-op are not getting jobs any quicker, because I know we certainly hire an enormous number of co-op and then offer them full-time employment. So, you know, we've got some programs at the secondary school level, but people don't know about them. Why aren't we talking more about the specialist high skills major program and encouraging more students to get into that, to give them a skill base that they can either go and get a job from or build on when they go on to college or university. And then now you're at the point where you want to make a decision. You're graduating high school, you're trying to make a decision on what to do. I wanted to tell you, I've never told my children to study what they love. I said, study something that you enjoy, that there's jobs for when you graduate, that has an earnings level that is going to match to your expectation of your lifestyle. And I've always been pushing for that information be made available. Our federal government has launched a website to provide exactly that information. You can go on, look at different fields of study, see the jobs, see what's your chance of getting a job, what's your probability of getting a job, and how much are you going to earn. Nobody knows about it. People don't know about that. People aren't talking. None of you talked about that program.
Well, why don't we give them a chance to do so, Linda?
Okay. Let me just one last thing. Lots of colleges and universities are working together. Somebody brought up combined education. I'm a huge fan of that you get some hands-on skills training in association with the critical thinking and more theoretical learning that you get at the universities. Lots of schools are doing this. Mohawk and McMaster, Western with Fanshawe, University of Guelph with a variety of other colleges where you can use your 2 years at college towards your engineering degree or whatever degree it is. Why aren't we talking more about those programs? There's lots of great things going on. Let's talk about those so that people can get educated and make better choices.
Terrific, thank you. Lauren, one of the things that you've come back to several times is this idea that students in particular are having to make decisions in the absence of good information.
Yeah.
And I think this goes right to Linda's point.
Yeah, and I think information is being made increasingly available. We publish that kind of information, salary expectations and that kind of thing on TalentEgg as well. I think the problem is that when things change so quickly, for example, 7 years ago when I was starting my company, mining engineering was the big hot thing to study because you could make a lot of money and there were lots and lots of jobs, and that's changed. When I was in high school, we were told that we should all become teachers because there were going to be many opportunities for teachers when we graduated. Of course, the unemployment rate for entry-level teachers in Ontario is 75% now, and on and on and on. So I think labor market information is useful and important, and it should be there because you should make decisions with the most amount of information out there. But I think that number one, you don't know what the future holds. And number two, I think that at the age of 17, again, you don't know yourself yet. You may know that you are good at math or that you think, being an astronaut is interesting, or you may be one of those people that, knows exactly what they want to do and you'll stick to it. But I think that, the vast majority of young people aren't there yet.
Okay, we've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to keep moving to some questions. Paul Desmarais Jr., if we could get the microphone up here to the front.
Yeah, hello, Paul Desmarais, Power Corporation. We spent a lot of time on university education, and in the end, I mean, give it 25% of Canadians go to university. What I'm really stuck with and enamored with is the sort of German-Swiss models of apprenticeships. And valuing apprenticeships, and you meet people and they're proud apprentices, they talk about it as if they were a university graduate. I'd like to hear all of you, what's your feeling about that, this generation, and what's your sense of how do we come to value apprenticeship in this country and let people who are 16, 17-year-olds suddenly say, hey, there's another opportunity there. I don't have to go to university. I can do other things and actually earn a darn good living and enjoy what I'm doing.
Okay, very quickly, comments on the alternatives to university.
I guess I don't know the answer about why young people are so push towards a university degree and not consider trades and apprenticeship, because I think you're right, like the data lays out a very lucrative and successful career if you want one in a number of trades. I think, again, I come back to maybe the influence that parents and networks have on people's decisions, and that Canada, one of the interesting things that it's hard to look at in the data, but Canada's very diverse, and I think different cultures and different ethnic communities have put pressure on their kids to achieve certain things, and they see certain types of professions as being more favorable than others. And I think part of the challenge we have is breaking the pressure that some families put on their kids. But once you get into high school and you have the opportunities, and again, it's up to, I think, teachers and the high schools themselves to open those opportunities up and to communicate that so the students can communicate that back to their parents. I think is one of the ways we do it. I think that's one of the challenges I'm seeing.
Thanks, David. Trish, quickly.
When I was a journalist in my 20s in the 1990s and we were suffering from a major recession, everybody was being told, my generation was told, that there's no more job for life, that you were going to have to be flexible, go get an education, get portable skills. You could have up to 5 careers in your lifetime. Careers, not jobs, is what the promise was. And so this was actually set almost a generation ago, and we oriented it that way. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because when I talk to skills trades workers, they're always surprised when I say, you're actually the next middle class. You're the ones who are going to have good paying, secure jobs. And I think that's a conversation well worth opening up in Canada.
Thanks, Trish. 3 rows back here on the right-hand side. Yes, that's right.
Art to fair, palace or furniture. Trish, just to follow directly on what you said, it was interesting that the whole discussion took place about that first training, first job. And we grew up the last 20 years saying you're going to have multiple jobs, multiple careers. So the question is, is that no longer the truth, just since you started that discussion? And if it is true, what kind of training at the front end is most suitable? Is the first job really an experimental job? It almost sounds like that first job should be your life career. And that's not the way we were raised, certainly in the last 20, 30 years.
Comment? Trish?
I think we're notoriously bad at predicting out. Every time, when I was a journalist, I had somebody from the Calgary, an editor from the Calgary Herald say, come to our class and say, because it was in the 1980s, and they said, you need to become lawyers because constitutional journalism is going to be the thing. And now it's like you need to understand climate change, or you need to understand, fineries of the Senate. And spending. So we're bad at predicting out. But I do think that the future is probably more as what they predicted, that the guarantee of a lifelong job for a lot of people is not going to be there. I'd like that to change. I think that we actually have that within our power to try to make that decision. But for young people, I advise them to take any avenue to learn formally and informally, because it's all valuable.
There was a hand, yes. The second row here on the right.
I'm John Mighton from Jump Math. Canada does pretty well on the PISA in math. We're slipping, though, we're in the middle. But we've seen evidence in a randomized controlled trial with Sick Kids Hospital that kids in elementary school could progress at about twice the rate of what they do in normal classrooms. So I'm wondering if anyone is looking at where the problem begins down around the elementary level and looking at ways to bring innovation into schools. There's been a dominant pedagogy for a long time and not a lot of openness to evidence or innovation, and I think it's a problem businesses need to look at, and I wonder if anyone's looking at helping the school system open up in that way.
Well, I think it's certainly important. One of the key characteristics, I think, to success in a lifelong career, success in terms of earnings and consistent employment, is being able to have skills that are transferable and to be able to move dynamically across occupations and that sort of thing throughout your career. And it begins when you're young, teaching children skills that are going to be transferable and to be dynamic and that kind of thing, and ensure they're provided the information that they need to know to choose a career as they progress from elementary school through secondary and into tertiary education as well, and to have full information and skill set that can be malleable over their career.
Great. Gentleman with the microphone.
Feridun Hamdalapur, President of the University of Waterloo. Great conversation. Just wanted to make 2 quick points. One is, I think we need to realize that we're talking about different sets of skills that require different types of graduates. So we cannot look for one standard type of graduate that will answer all of those questions. So it's important to realize that. We do tell our students that, yes, you have nothing absolutely lacking from those students who are studying at MIT or Stanford. We are interested in educating the leaders of tomorrow in various areas. So it's not just to go look for a job, to create those jobs. So innovation, entrepreneurship is also a very important element of what we do. And the third piece I should quickly mention, I'm sorry, I'll have to strongly disagree with you on what you said about co-op. 98 to 99% placement rate in the areas in the fields that students study. They earn significantly more money than non-co-op students, and they graduate with almost zero debt. More so, the graduates of my university, they have the lowest student loan default rate in this country, 1.7%. There is nothing else close to that. And last year, we had to turn away thousands of students with 90+ average, so they want to come and study in co-op programs because it is absolutely the best way to integrate work and university or post-secondary education together.
Great,
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, can we get one last question? We've got a minute and a half, and you're the last question.
Lots of pressure for the last question here. My name's Tom Haxel. I work with the Canadian Intern Association. Trish, I just want to say thank you very much for mentioning paid internships. We get a lot of emails from interns asking to be paid. It's very tough to finish 4 years and then have $28,000 in debt and then be asked to do an unpaid internship. Mona mentioned in the slides about the 4 things that successful companies do. Number 4 was saying that the first 3 months are the most important and vulnerable times for employees. If you're doing an internship, that is the first 3 months. So if you're unpaid, the way you look at your employer is very different. So I highly urge everyone to please consider paying your interns, just minimum wage even. But also I want to say thank you to Lauren. I thought your comment about how everything is changing so fast and that perhaps we're not ready for it even going into university. A gentleman over here referenced it as well. It almost seems like the conversation to be shifting towards high school, middle school and that, so that the students are even more prepared going into university instead of trying to fix things at that point. So,
great. And we hit our time bang on, John.
Thank you very much, both to you, Brian, as well as to the panel for a really interesting start. We just heard from Feridun from University of Waterloo, and so we're going to take a 15-minute break for coffee, and Feridun's predecessor as president of the University of Waterloo will be here to stimulate the next panel. He's taken a part-time job as Governor General of Canada, so we're looking forward to having him here. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel for a very interesting presentation.